76-year-old Syble Brumley was a beloved member of her community, a devout Baptist who was heavily involved in church activities, and the kind of woman everyone described as being like a second mother. Then, one chilly spring morning in April of 1997, after failing to show up for work, she was reported missing. Investigators found a troubling scene. Plants and potting soil were scattered around the porch. The front door had been smashed in, and there were clear indications of a struggle inside. Initially believed to have been a robbery gone wrong, detectives were perplexed to learn that nothing appeared to have been stolen. As her family struggled to try and develop new leads and to keep the case in the spotlight, investigators continued to hit dead ends with each new tip they followed. While many believe Syble had likely been targeted by someone she knew, others wondered if perhaps she had become yet another victim whose fate may lie in an eerie stretch of land between Texas and Louisiana known as the Dead Zone. This is Trace Evidence, Episode 209, The Vanishing of Syble Brumley. Welcome to Trace Evidence. I'm your host, Stephen Pacheco. Today we examine the mysterious disappearance of 76-year-old Syble Brumley. Before getting into the case, just a few quick notes about the show. Trace Evidence is a weekly true crime podcast focused on unsolved murders and disappearances. Visit trace-evidence.com for all social media links, episode breakdowns, donation options, and contact information. You can submit case suggestions through the website or by emailing me directly at traceevidencepod@gmail.com. Syble Brumley had lived in DeSoto Parish, Louisiana for several decades. She became a well-loved member of the community until one quiet morning when she was found missing. This is the vanishing of Syble Brumley. All across this country, there is a great wealth of natural wonders that beguile the eye and attract thousands upon thousands of tourists, sightseers, and hikers. From the treacherous beauty of Arizona's Superstition Mountains to the picturesque vistas and forestry of Yellowstone National Park. Almost every country has its most majestic and beautiful spots that are consistently written about, promoted, and are considered major beacons for tourism and exploration. However, not every area is home to visual splendor and emotional exhilaration. Some places carry with them a hint of danger, the threat of violence, and the mystery of loss. There are the infamous Texas killing fields, a 25-acre chunk of land in League City, just a mile from I-45 and less than 30 miles southeast of Houston. More than 30 bodies of murdered victims have been found in this area. More so remain missing, and whether or not their remains might be somewhere out there in the vast unknown has never been determined. Moving up to New England, there is the famous Bennington Triangle, an area of southwestern Vermont from which a number of people vanished during the 40s and 50s. While many believe the Bennington Triangle is little more than the creation of an author, others believe there is wisdom in heeding a warning. Then there is the Dead Zone. No, not a place where your phone struggles to find a signal, and certainly not a novel written by Stephen King. The Dead Zone is a large area of land which encompasses parts of Louisiana, Arkansas, and Texas. This was an area known for being the hunting grounds of at least two serial killers, Robert Charles Brown and James Edward Wood. Dozens of people have mysteriously vanished from this area, and many of them disappeared from a number of western and northwestern Louisiana parishes that cross into the Dead Zone. Major highways intersect one another at various points in this area, creating a complex network by which any number of violent or vicious criminals might enter, attack, and exit without ever being seen. On a cool, quiet evening just south of Mansfield, Louisiana, another person vanished without a trace. 76-year-old Syble Brumley had lived in her rural DeSoto Parish home for decades. After the passing of her husband, she continued on, taking care of the home and living and working out of Mansfield. It's unlikely Syble gave much thought to the Dead Zone or was even aware of it, but sometime during the night of Monday, April 27th, 1997, she would become another person swallowed up into that unknown darkness. Syble Weeks was born on Friday, August 27th, 1920, to parents Frank and Corrine Weeks in Shelby, an unincorporated community located in Austin County, Texas. At the time of her birth, she was the third child born to Frank and Corrine, and she would go on to have two older sisters, a younger sister, and a younger brother. While Syble was born in Texas, her family would shift back across the state line into Louisiana, where both of her parents had been born and raised. By 1930, when Syble was turning 10 years old, her family were living in Sabine Parish, where Frank's occupation was listed as a general farmer. Not a great deal of information about Syble's early life is publicly known. However, records help in determining specific location and family details over the course of the next few decades. As of the 1940 census, Syble was listed as being 19 years old and living together with her new husband, Robert Gaston Brumley, referred to by both the nicknames RG and Hip. At the time, RG was 13 years older than Syble, had previously been married, and had several children from his first wife. According to divorce records, Brumley and his first wife, Jewel, had separated and were officially divorced in July of 1937. At the time, RG was listed as being employed as the proprietor of a grocery store attached to a filling station. Syble was listed as a helping worker at the grocery store. By this point, the couple had just moved out of Sabine Parish, heading north into DeSoto, where they settled in a home off Highway 171, just south of Mansfield. Over the next decade, Syble and RG would go on to have two children together, a son named Billy, born in July of 1940, and a daughter, Sandra, born in November of 1944. Towards the tail end of the 40s, moving into the early stages of the 50s, there would be a few changes in the couple's lives. RG went through a career change, no longer running the grocery store. He was now listed as the owner-operator of a local dairy. Due in part to the young ages of their children, Syble was no longer working, and instead had her occupation listed as homemaker, suggesting she had taken care of the kids and the daily operation of the home while RG was at the dairy. Clifton, one of RG's children from his first marriage, was also listed as living with the family at this time and was working in a local barber shop. According to the Shreveport Times, Syble was a hard-working woman who was strong in her determination and very loving and protective of her family. After working for several years at a local department store, she went on to take up employment as a stylist at what was then referred to as a beauty shop. She had been described as a devout Baptist who attended Mansfield Baptist Church, always sitting in the same spot. The Reverend Mike Stewart later explained that Syble was not merely a parishioner, but also was heavily involved in church activities, including event planning and Sunday school services. Stewart stated that Syble was, quote, one of the most faithful members we have here. Everyone loved her, and she loved everyone, end quote. This is a common through line in Syble's life. Almost everyone who knew her referred to her as extremely kind, caring, always willing to lend a hand. She was warm, welcoming, and considerate, so much so that no one ever called her by her name, instead using affectionate nicknames. Her daughter, Sandra, explained, quote, Mother is just a person everyone loves. Everyone calls her Mama or Granny or Aunt Syble. She is more than my Mama. She is my best friend, and I can go to her with anything. Anyone could, end quote. Sadly, tragedy would strike for the Brumley family in the summer of 1975. Syble's husband of more than 30 years, RG, passed away on July 31st at the age of 67. This was a harsh blow to the family, and at just the age of 54, Syble found herself widowed. While there are no words that can appropriately detail the grief, pain, and anguish Syble must have endured during this time in her life, she kept herself strong and tried to lead her family by example. RG was laid to rest on Friday, August 2nd in Mitchell Cemetery beneath a simple stone which bore an empty slot, a slot which was supposed to become Syble's final resting place there, beside her husband. Unfortunately, 22 years later, in April of 1997, Syble would mysteriously vanish, and the space beside her husband remains empty, all these years later. Mansfield, Louisiana is the parish seat of DeSoto Parish and is located in northwest Louisiana, approximately 20 miles east of the Texas border. Mansfield has never been a large city, with its highest population totaling at less than 7,000 residents in 1980. Over the next decade, the population would decline by nearly 20%, and today, Mansfield is tabulated at just less than 5,000 people. Syble continued to live in the home she had shared with RG, located along Highway 171, approximately 2.5 miles south of Mansfield. At the time, Highway 171 was a 2-lane road which entered Mansfield from the northwest and exited due south, curving southeast for several hundred miles to where it terminated in Lake Charles. By 1997, Syble was 76 years old. She was a mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother, and she'd lived alone. According to multiple reports of the time, Syble had dated in the years following the death of her husband, but no one was confirmed to have been an official boyfriend type. Based upon the information relayed, it sounds as though she went out from time to time, kept things rather casual, and may have been seeking companionship and someone to go out with, rather than anything leaning towards romance or any kind of commitment. Retired from full-time work, Syble was still highly active and, despite her age, was physically fit and fully capable of taking care of herself. She spent a lot of time out working around her house, on her knees planting flower beds and expanding her backyard garden. In her free time, she often created crafts and gifts for her family members who noted that she was always working on something for them. In addition to gardening and crafting, Syble wanted to keep busy, and so she joined up with Project Green Thumb, a local program which placed retirees in part-time jobs. 2 years before her disappearance, Syble wound up being assigned to reception and clerical work at the DeSoto Parish Sheriff's Department, where she worked 2.5 days a week. As was seemingly always the case, Syble's co-workers at the Sheriff's Department loved her and thought very highly of her. Perhaps this is why, when she didn't show up one day, they became so quickly concerned. The morning of Tuesday, April 28th, was a cool, overcast day with temperatures lingering in the mid-50s and light winds sailing in from the southwest. Syble was scheduled to work a shift at the sheriff's office that morning, but never arrived, and this immediately drew concern from both co-workers and family members. Syble wasn't the type to skip out on a shift, especially without so much as a phone call. Assuming that maybe Syble had overslept, was ill, or couldn't reach the phone for one reason or another, Karen Burr, one of her grandchildren, made the short trip to the home on Highway 171. But immediately upon arriving, she knew something terrible had happened. According to initial descriptions given, there were obvious signs of forced entry at the home. Patio furniture and potted plants near the front door were knocked over, spilling soil all over the area. The front door had sustained incredible damage, as had the screen door. Speaking to the Shreveport Times, Karen would later state, quote, "When I went over there this morning about 9, that's when I saw the door had been broken into." End quote. After a quick run-through of the house to try and locate Syble, the DeSoto Parish Sheriff's Department was contacted, and the 76-year-old's disappearance was reported. Less than an hour later, Syble's home was swarmed by deputies and investigators. Given the appearance of the home, both inside and out, it seemed quite clear from the first moments that Syble had been the victim of foul play, with someone having forced their way into the home and abducting her. While initial reports were somewhat vague in details about the crime scene, over the years, several new pieces of information have been released which paint a more vivid, albeit disturbing, image of how Syble was taken. Investigators reported that upon arriving at Syble's home, they quickly made note of the disarray of furniture and plants near the front door. Upon closer inspection, it appeared as though someone had cut through the screen of the storm door just enough to reach through and unlatch the lock. At that point, the assailant focused on the door. While it has never been stated for certain whether or not it's believed the suspect utilized a tool or weapon in his attempt to break into the house, damage to the door was reportedly significant. It was collapsed inward, beginning at the bottom and running approximately 5 to 6 feet up the length of the door, suggesting that someone had hit the door repeatedly, possibly by kicking, until the door frame actually gave way, splitting and allowing the door to fly open. Chief Deputy Mike Lee stated that once investigators entered the home, they saw several indications that a struggle had taken place and that the assailant had searched certain areas in the home. While I can't confirm that Syble's closet was one of these searched locations, her granddaughter, Tracy Cowden, later stated that Syble's shoes were strewn across the bedroom floor, saying, quote, "Whoever did it, it looked like they just reached up into the top of that closet and just threw shoes, all the shoes. There were shoes everywhere." End quote. The house, however, wasn't exactly in disarray, and because of this, it seemed more likely that whoever had broken in was searching for something specific that they believed or possibly that they knew was in the home. Chief Deputy Mike Lee pointed this out, saying, quote, "It wasn't quite what I would call ransacked." End quote. In terms of anything which may have been missing, family members brought in weren't able to point out much of anything that should have been there. It seemed that the only things missing, in addition to Syble, were the clothes she had worn to work the day before and her purse. Her new car, a blue Chevy Lumina, was sitting untouched in the garage. Keith Burr, married to Syble's granddaughter Karen, told the media that they didn't think Syble had very much to take anyway, saying, quote, "There was not a whole lot missing from what we can tell. She didn't have much, just her." End quote. Speaking with family and friends, investigators tried to narrow down the last time anyone had seen Syble alive. Her granddaughter Karen told deputies that she had come by the house to visit the 76-year-old the night before she was discovered missing. She left at approximately 8:30 p.m., a little more than 12 hours before Syble was reported missing. According to Karen, Syble was in good shape, didn't appear worried or concerned about anything, and was still dressed in the clothes she had worn to work on Monday the 27th, these being black pants and a beige blouse. Those clothes were never found in the home, suggesting that whoever had broken in had either done so before Syble had changed and prepared for bed, or perhaps had forced her to put clothes on, grabbing her most recently worn clothes in the process. Investigators did manage to find a few pieces of evidence in the home which could help identify the suspect. Tony Morris, then a detective with the sheriff's department, reported that unidentified fingerprints had been found in the house, though when they ran them through the system, they didn't kick back a match to anyone on file. Morris would later state that in addition to the prints, they had found a disturbing piece of evidence. He explained, quote, "We found a fingernail in that house that did not belong to her." End quote. They've never revealed anything else about this fingernail, and I could only find reference to it in one article. Obviously, there are a lot of questions about the fingernail. Did it appear to have been broken off during a struggle? Was it a real fingernail? Was DNA run on it? Where exactly in the house was it found? These are all questions for which no answers have ever been supplied. Given that Syble was last seen alive around 8:30 p.m. and was reported missing at 9 a.m., it seems most likely that the intruder gained entry to the home sometime during the night. Given that her work clothes from the day were missing, it seems like this may have happened prior to her going to bed. I don't know what Syble's schedule was like, if she tended to stay up late, but given that she was supposed to be at the sheriff's office the next morning, it seems unlikely she would have stayed up late into the early morning hours without showering or changing clothes for bed. While investigators have never commented on it, many believe that the suspect had to have broken in sometime prior to midnight. While not a lot of specific detail has ever been given, several people close to the case have made the suggestion that whoever had broken in was likely someone that knew Syble, or at a minimum, had a familiarity with the house. There doesn't seem to be anyone who believes this crime had a random aspect to it, as it had previously been described as a targeted abduction. Tracy, Syble's granddaughter, did offer up a little speculation, though. Speaking to KTBS News, Tracy noted that the intruder may have been aware that the front door was the easiest point of entry because a security bar held the back door shut. She explained, quote, "We feel whoever did it knew that bar was across the back door and they couldn't kick it in. We just feel like it was someone that knew the house." End quote. Searches of Syble's property were conducted, though nothing significant was found. Since she had lived out of town in a rural area, Much of her property was surrounded by dense shrubbery, briar patches, and swampy areas. At one point, the DeSoto Sheriff's Office utilized a helicopter to search from the sky, though they never managed to find anything by this method. In early May, in hopes of generating new leads and information, Syble's family issued a reward offer of $50,000 for information that leads to Syble or the person responsible for her disappearance. According to Chief Deputy Mike Lee, while they had interviewed several people and followed different leads, they had not yet developed any suspects or a specific motive for the crime. For the next few weeks, investigators continued following up on leads and tips called in by locals, but frequently found themselves hitting dead ends. Wondering if perhaps Syble's abduction might be one crime in a series, investigators reached out to law enforcement agencies in surrounding Louisiana parishes, as well as those just across the border in East Texas. Detectives requested details about any similar crimes and the names of any suspects who may have been involved in them. Detective Tony Morris explained, quote, "We've been receiving leads from the public since this began, and we still get them daily. We've brought people in for questioning, and we got nothing of consequence. But we were able to eliminate some people from consideration as suspects." End quote. Syble's house remained vacant after investigators had gone through in search of evidence. Yellow ribbons were tied around trees on the property, many of them surrounded by bushes and flower beds that Syble herself had planted and maintained. Even her usual seat at Mansfield Baptist was adorned by ribbons and flowers. The community were shocked by the abduction and came out to show their support for the family, volunteering their time and energy to try and help and bring Syble home. Inside of the first few weeks, more than 3,000 flyers bearing Syble's image, description, and the circumstances of her disappearance were handed out to locals, put up in storefront windows throughout Mansfield and surrounding cities, and many were given to truck drivers who posted them throughout the country. They also mailed flyers, faxed them, and gave bundles to businesses so they could put up more as needed. The more time passed, the more dangerous the situation became. Both investigators and the family knew that time was their enemy, and the longer Syble was gone, the less of a chance there was that she would be found safe. Her daughter, Sandra Utze, was devastated by her mother's disappearance but refused to give in to the dark thoughts creeping up in her mind. She dedicated all of her available time to trying to spread awareness and find answers. She explained, quote, "The feeling right now is worse than death. The not knowing if she's dead or alive. We just have to hope right now. I talk to her so much every day in my prayers, telling her to keep her strength up." End quote. By the end of May, a month after Syble had last been seen, the investigation was running out of avenues to explore. Detective Morris told The Times that, in the weeks that had passed, they had followed up on nearly 40 leads and questioned a dozen people, but they didn't have enough to charge anyone with anything. According to Morris, the sheriff's office was still receiving tips on a daily basis, and they returned to Syble's home on more than one occasion to seek out additional evidence. Unfortunately, whatever it was that they needed, they just couldn't find it. The family continued working to try and keep the case in the spotlight, and the community wouldn't let it die down either. It brought in a new level of fear, leaving elderly residents to wonder if perhaps they might be next. A few weeks later, on Saturday, June 7th, the family organized a massive search which would focus in on the sprawling landscape surrounding Syble's home. The plan was to gather up enough people to commit to searching the more than 500 acres of land, which included dense pine forests, swamps, and difficult-to-maneuver terrain. Beginning at sunrise, approximately 80 searchers went out trying to cover every inch of that land. Many got down on their hands and knees, brushing up leaves and weeds as they searched for even the slightest clue. While the sheriff's office had previously done air searches, the family wanted to be more exacting, with Tracy Cowden telling The Times, quote, "The only search done so far was by helicopter, and they were looking for movement or vehicles. We just had to do this today to know she's not here." End quote. Billy Brumley, Syble's son, spoke with reporters about the search. Billy himself could not take part, Medical issues made it impossible for him to search the harsh terrain, but he was there at the house showing his support and doing what he could to contribute to the hunt for his mother. Billy explained, quote, "Since this happened, there's been an outpour of love and care for Mother, and it just amazes me. I really feel guilty about not being out there, getting muddy and bloody with them." End quote. The search, which ended at noon, didn't turn up any new evidence, and many of the searchers came walking back to the house covered in mud and scratches. Many of those searchers didn't even know Syble or her family, but wanted to contribute whatever they could to try and find answers. Jimmy Prudhomme, living in nearby Grand Cane, told reporters that while he had no connection to the family, he had heard about the search and couldn't in good conscience just ignore it. He explained, quote, "That's the way this community is. If there's a crisis, we pull together." End quote. Sadly, with no results from the search and no solid evidence linking anyone to the crime, the case began slowing down. It was still being worked, but not to the extent it had been, as deputies had to continue investigating other crimes and incidents as they occurred. Detective Morris noted that they did have people they had questioned who were not cleared through their investigation, but they didn't have anything to charge them with. In the absence of anything which might indicate who exactly went after Syble the night she vanished, another unsolved disappearance began causing many to wonder if perhaps there was a connection. The first case that came to mind was the disappearance of 77-year-old Lurleen DeWitt. DeWitt had been described as a widow who lived with financial comfort, though not luxury, in a middle-class neighborhood. In September of 1996, 7 months prior to Syble's disappearance, DeWitt was reported missing by her son, Cleo. She lived in a house with him on Francine Street, just off Oxford Road in Mansfield, approximately a mile and a half northeast of Syble's home. On the evening of Friday, September 27th, DeWitt's son saw his mother for the last time around 9 p.m. According to his statements, at around 1 a.m., he discovered that the carport door was open and his mother was nowhere to be found. Nothing was missing from the home, there were no direct signs of foul play, and DeWitt hadn't taken anything with her. At the time, investigators believed it was possible that DeWitt had become disoriented and wandered away, although this was confusing as there had been storm warnings all day, and it didn't make a lot of sense for an elderly woman to wander off in the middle of one. Just prior to her disappearance, DeWitt had stayed overnight at the hospital after tests had shown that her blood pressure was dangerously high. Reportedly, there were no other signs of any other health issues. Sergeant Melvin Drite of the DeSoto Sheriff's Department admitted investigators were flummoxed, telling the Times, quote, "We've talked to relatives, neighbors. Nobody has reported seeing her. Why would a woman walk out in the middle of a storm?" End quote. Despite multiple searches and an ongoing investigation, Lurleen DeWitt has never been found. Authorities later determined, perhaps in part due to Syble's case, that more than likely DeWitt had opened her door to someone during the night and then been forcibly abducted. Investigators theorized it may have been someone, or perhaps more than one person, who were targeting elderly locals under the belief that they had access to large sums of cash. While her family members have been ruled out, no suspect has ever been named in that case. According to investigators, the closest they had to a suspect was someone they eventually ruled out after it was confirmed he was out of town the night of the crime. As questions regarding a possible link between the crimes began surfacing, investigators were quick to address it. Curtis McCoy, then the assistant chief of the Mansfield Police Department, told reporters they had found nothing to indicate the two crimes were linked. Neither woman knew the other, they didn't run in the same circles, and no one from either family was connected to anyone from the other. While there are similarities, two older women abducted from their homes, which were just miles apart, there were many differences as well. The key difference, according to investigators, was the method of entry. Lurleen had likely opened her door to her assailant, while the suspect in Syble's case had kicked the door in. One crime appeared violent and targeted, the other calm and perhaps random. Mary Robbins, a neighbor of DeWitt's, expressed her fear, telling reporters, quote, "When you don't know what happened, there is a reason for concern. There was no break-in. There's just so many unanswered questions." End quote. Then Mansfield Police Chief Don English was less optimistic about DeWitt's case in the months following her disappearance. While they could not confirm foul play had been involved, English leaned towards that likelihood. Asked about locating the missing 77-year-old, English told the Times that she could be anywhere, though morbidly he added, quote, "There's many a foot of soil in a parish. There's many a place in the woods that hasn't been touched by a human foot in a long time." End quote. Whether or not there is a direct connection between the cases has never been established, though many find it difficult to look past the similarities in victims and the proximity of the two crime scenes. By April of 1998, a year after Syble was abducted, Detective Tony Morris was still very methodical in what he would and would not say about the case. However, he revealed that they had made some progress. Some theories about a potential motive had been eliminated from consideration. However, Morris noted that some theories established in the early days remained as a foundation for their continued pursuit of Syble and her assailant. Curiously, an important detail was revealed in the same article in which Morris discussed their view regarding motive. For the first and only time, it was stated that perhaps Karen Burr, Syble's granddaughter, was not in fact the last person to see her alive. According to the Times, investigators had thoroughly questioned a repairman who was also referenced as being the last person to see the missing woman. Now, according to investigators, they managed to eliminate the repairman as a suspect. However, Syble's daughter Sandra has her own ideas about a potential suspect. Sandra stated that she believed her mother had been targeted by someone she knew, vaguely described as a local person obsessed with her. While this person has never officially been labeled as a suspect or even publicly named, it's interesting as most people believe the perpetrator knew Syble and was familiar with the layout of the house. For their part, investigators wouldn't comment about this person or anyone else who had, not as of that time, been eliminated as a suspect. Sandra went on to explain that in the year that had passed, things hadn't grown any easier. The absence of her mother left a massive void in her life and the lives of all family members. She stated, quote, "I don't think any of us ever have a good day anymore. It's either bad days or real bad days." End quote. While the investigation had slowed down, many people connected to the case spoke about it in darker terms. Investigators stated their belief that a year later, without any sightings or traces of Syble, there was a high probability she had been killed. Despite this, Sandra wouldn't give up her belief that her mother was alive and one day she would find her. She consulted with a so-called psychic and passed information on to detectives, continued manufacturing flyers and putting them up everywhere she could. She reached out to America's Most Wanted, hoping to get her mother's story on the show, and she kept detailed logs of friends and family members' recollections of the days leading up to the 28th when Syble was discovered missing. To her, it seemed, many people were surrendering to the more grim likelihood, but she was unwilling to do so, saying, quote, "You don't know who to listen to, so we listen to everybody. Some have already given up, I think. I just can't do that right now." End quote. One of the people she was referencing may have been her own brother Billy. For a year, he spent all of his free time trying to imagine what could have happened, who might have done it and why. He tortured himself imagining different scenarios, violent altercations, and terrifying motives that may have driven someone to target his mother. Finally, he managed to find some peace in accepting the belief that his mother was likely gone. He, like his mother, was strong in his faith and believed she had likely gone on to a better place to reunite with her family. That didn't make things any easier, especially without answers and justice, but it was enough to keep him from tearing himself apart over guilt at his inability to protect her from this unforeseeable crime. Unfortunately, the answers were no closer to being found. The investigation into Syble's disappearance began growing cold. Soon, days turned to weeks, weeks to months, and months to years. While her family tried to continue on with the search, each new day filled with unanswered questions and an unknown fate made every day into a waking nightmare. April 28, 2001, marked 4 years since Syble had last been seen. Investigators had been busy. The case file built by detectives had grown and now weighed 17 pounds. Donnie Barber was appointed as the new lead investigator. However, Tony Morris remained involved and considered solving the case a personal mission for his career. He'd spent a lot of time with the family, he felt close to them, and he wanted to bring them answers. Morris explained this to the Times, saying, quote, "When a case gets to that point of not being solved, then it's really frustrating, and it strains the relationship with officers and the family, and it's difficult to deal with. In 22 years, this is the most frustrating case I've had. This case is not closed. It will never be closed." End quote. 4 months later, in August, what should have been Syble's 81st birthday came and went. A time where she should have been celebrating with those she loved, and instead what remained behind was a vacant home, a long series of questions, and not a single answer. Sandra expressed her frustration, noting how cases which receive national attention have a higher likelihood of being solved. She wondered why so many missing persons cases failed to receive the notoriety of others. She also acknowledged that, for much of the family, there was no longer any hope of finding Syble alive. She stated, quote, "I think there's still a chance I could hear from her, but most of the family has given up. It's hard to understand how we could go this long without finding something out. Until they tell me they've found proof of her remains, I have to continue to hope that she is alive somewhere. I keep my faith in God that I will find an answer to it someday." End quote. 3 years later, in July of 2004, Syble's family made the difficult decision to have her legally declared dead. On Friday, July 9th, DeSoto District Judge Charles Adams ruled that enough information existed to show that Syble had likely been the victim of a homicide, and so he ordered that a death certificate be issued. Gloria Brumley, Billy's wife, spoke to the media about the painful ordeal that they had gone through to have this done, but also of the pain they continued to endure without answers. She explained, quote, "We're still saddened by it. Although she is legally dead, that's no consolation because we want to know what happened to her. We are not satisfied at all." End quote. Around the same time that the family was filing to have Syble declared dead, investigators at the DeSoto Sheriff's Department were looking over the case file with fresh eyes. Several months earlier, Lieutenant Robert Davidson had asked then Sheriff Rodney Arbuckle if he might go over the files and take a look for himself. In his examination of the case, Davidson discovered that several pieces of evidence had not yet been submitted to a lab for DNA analysis using more modern techniques. While the evidence in question has not been revealed, Lieutenant Davidson noted he'd had discussions with a lab technician about the test results of one specific item. Sheriff Arbuckle told reporters that this did not guarantee they'd uncover new information, saying, quote, "You don't always solve every case. You try your best. But sometimes you don't have that one piece of evidence to push it any further. Having more items tested at the crime lab might help, and it might not." End quote. This same year, it was announced that the Louisiana Department of Transportation was going to be conducting a large expansion project along Highway 171. The plan was to widen the roadway out, adding lanes on each side, thus transforming the 2-lane highway into a 4-lane. As a result of this project, and due to the proximity of Syble's home to the highway, the state informed the family they would need to tear down the wood-framed house. In addition to this, Billy's home, which was across the highway from his mother's, would also be torn down. Gloria Brumley acknowledged that it was another difficult process for the family, saying, quote, "It's another page tore out of the book. Along with losing her, we're going to lose her home. Our hearts are still torn apart." End quote. Tragically, just 2 years later, on Thursday, October 5th, 2006, Sandra Utze passed away after a long battle with cancer. She had spent the last 9 years of her life trying to maintain her health while also being overwhelmed by her drive to find her mother or the person responsible for her disappearance. She never gave up her hope that Syble was still alive, and while her father was listed as preceding her death in her obituary, her mother was listed as missing. In the years leading up to and following Syble's disappearance, several other people vanished from an area known as the Dead Zone, a wide swath of land which covers pieces of Texas, Arkansas, and northwest Louisiana. Lurleen DeWitt vanished from Mansfield in September of 96, Syble in April of 97. 26-year-old Christy Gwen O'Pry vanished from Shreveport in July of 96. 29-year-old Deshanna Gray from Logansport in November of 2000. 19-year-old Constance Anderson would disappear from Mansfield in January of 2006. None of these cases have been resolved, and they are far from the only unsolved missing persons cases which remain open and fall inside the borders of the Dead Zone. The Louisiana Depository for Unidentified and Missing Persons currently lists more than 500 unsolved disappearances across the state. Sadly, this is where the case of Syble Brumley seemingly hits a wall. In the more than 25 years since Syble was abducted from her home, few answers have been found, and many originally connected to the case, be they family members or investigators, have since passed away or retired. The more time passes, the more difficult it becomes. In 2016, Detective Tony Morris officially retired. While he celebrated much that he had accomplished in his career, he regretted his inability to bring answers to the Brumley family. He explained, quote, "I basically have failed them up until this point as far as my career goes. This is my greatest disappointment." End quote. As a final tragic note to add, just a few weeks ago on Tuesday, November 29th, 2022, Syble's son Billy passed away at the age of 82. Described as a devout Baptist, Billy had come to accept that his mother was deceased, though he remained hopeful that he would see justice served and an arrest made sometime during his life. His wife, Gloria, passed away 4 years earlier in 2018, and as time continues to move forward, the responsibility and duty of parents has been passed down to children and grandchildren who, to this day, continue to fight to find out what happened to Syble. Dwayne Brumley explained the pain of loss without answers, telling KTBS News, quote, "It's one of those deals where we've seen a lot of our loved ones pass on, and we can see the sorrow in their eyes because they didn't know where she was or what happened to her." End quote. When last seen, Syble Brumley was described as being a white female with brown hair and blue eyes, standing 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighing approximately 160 pounds. Syble has pierced ears and at the time of her disappearance wore glasses with large plastic frames. Syble was 76 years old when last seen, though many have stated she looked years younger than she actually was. While no description has ever been given about what Syble may have been wearing at the time of her disappearance, it was noted that she was last seen in black pants and a beige blouse. She was last seen at her home, formerly located approximately 2 miles south of Mansfield along Highway 171, at 8:30 p.m. on Monday, April 27, 1997. While law enforcement considers it highly unlikely and science places the odds strongly against it, were Syble still alive, she would have turned 102 this year. 25 years ago, someone forced their way into Syble Brumley's home. A struggle ensued, the assailant searched for something, and by the time the sun came up the next day, the bright, kind, loving, and compassionate mother, friend, grandmother, co-worker, and great-grandmother was gone. No trace of her has ever been found. No details about a motive have ever been revealed. Far too long has passed for this family to go on without knowing the truth, and her children have already passed away without ever knowing what became of their beloved mother. Asked her thoughts on the case just this past year, her granddaughter, Tracy Cowden, replied, quote, "You don't think that someone would just vanish off the face of the earth, but she did. Just one day she was here, then the next day, she was gone. Day to day, you just wonder and you need closure. Whether she is alive or dead, it does not matter. We just need to bring her home." 25 years have passed since 76-year-old Syble Brumley mysteriously vanished. Left behind were all the telltale signs of a home invasion. Someone cut through the screen of her storm door, unlocking it. Then the front door was beaten so violently that it began bending inwards before the wooden frame cracked, allowing the door to swing open. Inside, police found signs of a struggle and indications that whoever had broken into the home had searched specific areas, looking for something. What they may have been seeking, cash, jewelry, or something else, has never been revealed, if indeed it is known. Strangely, the only things noted as being missing, besides Syble herself, were the clothes she had last been seen wearing and her purse. At the time, investigators had to try and determine what might have happened, why it happened, and who would have had something to benefit from this crime. Was this a random incident, someone who preyed upon the home of an elderly widow, or was it personal? Many family members believed that the assailant had to have had knowledge of the house and knew to target the front door instead of the more secured back door. Detectives tended to agree, believing that while the crime could have been random, it certainly had the earmarks of a forced and premeditated attack of which Syble herself seemed to be the primary target. There's been a lot of conversation about that area known as the Dead Zone, an area that Syble lived in. Many people have disappeared from that area, been found dead inside of it, and serial killers have been known to stalk throughout the zone. While Syble certainly vanished while inside of the Dead Zone, there doesn't appear to be a great deal of evidence or information which would suggest that her crime was connected to any other. For a long time, it was theorized that perhaps she had been targeted by the same person or persons who had taken 77-year-old Lurleen DeWitt less than a year earlier. However, no evidence has ever been found to link the cases. So, that leaves us somewhat in the same spot as both investigators and the family. No way of knowing for certain if it was random, no way of knowing for certain if it was targeted. So, let's begin with the random aspect and work our way towards the idea that Syble may have known the person responsible. To try and analyze all of the missing person and unsolved murder cases within the so-called Dead Zone would take countless hours. There are a lot of cases inside of the zone for which investigators have no clues. However, there are other cases for which they have persons of interest. It's not to say that all of the cases are connected, far from it, but more so the fact that this area is known to be one frequented by killers and predators looking for their next victim, and there is a wealth of unexplored land where bodies might be concealed and never found. Looking at it from the angle of a random attack, there's a few possibilities. Firstly, Syble lived just off Highway 171, one of the busier roads in that area. This would have allowed the abductor to pull off the road, conduct the break-in and abduction, and be back on the road moving away at a high rate of speed within minutes. From there, Syble could have been taken in almost any direction, and with multiple interstates passing through and intersecting each other, by the time she was reported missing the next morning, if indeed she was still alive, she could have been hours and hours and hundreds of miles away. So I suppose what you have to wonder is, was this random in the sense that someone could have merely selected a house to break into without any previous knowledge or planning, or someone could have known Syble but only by sight? Perhaps they'd seen her around town, saw her driving a new car, or just assumed that because she was older and a widow, she must have a large sum of money in the bank or possibly hidden in her home. A lot of different theories have been suggested in terms of motive, and while there isn't enough to entirely rule out the concept that this was random, there's not a whole lot that makes it seem likely either. Sure, someone could have just decided to break into the house, but they'd had to have known they were running the risk that they weren't going to get anything out of it. Since we know of no valuables missing from the home, you have to wonder if this really was about robbery or if it was always an abduction and homicide scenario. You'd think if someone were randomly going through the house in search of stuff to steal, they'd have made more of a mess and gone into more rooms. Given what investigators have stated, it sounds almost like once they gained entry, they knew exactly where they wanted to look. So why take Syble at all if this was a random robbery? Well, she could have seen the assailant's face or perhaps recognized him altogether. She may have seen what the assailant was driving and been able to give enough information to have him arrested. At the same time, maybe the reason she was taken and her purse was missing was because the suspect planned to force her to withdraw money from her bank account. Maybe somewhere along the way, the decision was made not to do that. Or it's entirely possible that Syble didn't carry an ATM card, so when she was taken out, she couldn't withdraw money for them. Honestly, it's just difficult to say. While random crimes like this have happened and will continue to happen, this is a case where I tend to agree with the family. It just seems much more likely that whoever was involved knew Syble, knew that house, planned this out, and was driven to do so by a motive that we've yet to understand or discover. I think it's very interesting that the back door of the house was reinforced with a steel security bar, but the front door wasn't. Now, maybe Syble never used the back door and it just made sense to keep it secured in that manner all the time, but most people secure both doors if they're going to secure them at all. Regardless, if someone had been in the home before, they surely would have known that the front door was the easiest point of entry. So, this person or persons shows up at the house sometime after 8:30 p.m. and before 9 a.m. They cut through the screen of the storm door, unsnap the latch, and then begin beating in the front door. Here is where some of my confusion about the circumstances of the abduction begin to surface. Kicking that door in would not have been a quiet act. It would have been loud as hell and echoing through that house, and certainly would have been heard. If Syble hadn't gone to bed and was still in the clothes she'd worn that day, how could she have not heard it? In fairness, we have no way of knowing if she heard the door being beaten or not, but if she did, she either didn't have the time to dial 911, or for a reason we can't understand, she chose not to. Some have suggested that the lack of a 911 call may indicate that Syble knew the person breaking in. Maybe she was trying to calm them down or talk them out of whatever was making them try to get inside. I could see that to a degree. While you would think someone breaking your door down would be more than enough reason to call the police, some people don't. How often have family members chosen not to call the police on a loved one who acted violently? How often has someone chosen not to report terrible behavior on the part of a romantic partner because they're scared or feel guilty about getting them arrested? Again, we have no way of knowing if this is what happened here, but it's all very strange. Unfortunately, we've got such an absence of information, it can be difficult to try and figure out why someone would have done this. Syble certainly doesn't sound like she was a wealthy woman living a financially luxurious lifestyle. She didn't go around town flashing cash. She didn't own a ton of valuable items or jewelry, and given the way everyone spoke of her, what money she did have went towards her family and her church. Sandra, Syble's daughter, made a vague comment about someone who was obsessed with Syble and may have been responsible for the crime. Without knowing more about this person, it's almost impossible to analyze this particular theory. However, we know that Syble was widowed in 1975 and dated off and on over the next 22 years. Some people believe that one of the men she had dated, perhaps one she had ended things with, may have been angry enough to force his way in and abduct her. Curiously, however, when Sandra mentions this person, she doesn't say he's an ex-boyfriend. She doesn't call him a former family friend. She just describes him as a local. If indeed someone were obsessed with Syble to the point of striking out in this violent way, it seems likely more people would be aware of him, and Syble likely would have known who it was and may have expressed fear or concern. That's where everything in this case kind of shifts. We know police found unidentified fingerprints inside the home, so it's someone who's not in the system, which implies they either hadn't ever been arrested, or perhaps they hadn't been arrested for something which would have resulted in their fingerprints going into a national database. Since these fingerprints were addressed by investigators, I tend to believe they were found either in locations or on items which they believe were touched by the assailant, and not just someone who was randomly visiting the house at an earlier time. Then, there's the fingernail. I wish we had more detail about the nail found in the home, but all we've been told is that it was not Syble's. I'm left to assume that this wasn't just a random nail clipping, but perhaps something that occurred during a struggle. DNA can be obtained from a fingernail, and I know evidence in this case was sent out for DNA analysis, but there's never been anything else said about it. So it appears there are pieces of forensic evidence. They just haven't been linked to anyone. Unless this fingernail was a press-on type, frequently worn by females, then it would had to have been ripped off, right? Did police interview anyone in the days following the crime who was missing a fingernail or had an obvious injury to their finger? That's another question we don't have an answer to, but we do know something else. According to several investigators, they had a suspect in this case since the early days, and they've never been able to eliminate this person from the suspect pool. Now, we don't know who this is, if they're still alive or living in the area, but logic would dictate either this person's prints didn't match what was found in the house, their DNA didn't match anything that may have been found on the evidence, or investigators never had enough evidence to obtain this person's prints and DNA for comparison. That being the case, it almost sounds like you could be looking for someone who doesn't have a long criminal record, or perhaps no record at all. That would make things vastly more complicated. As a final note here, one of the key details investigators attempted to determine in order to solve this crime was motive. Obviously, this is a case where we don't have a solid motive. Maybe money, maybe a personal vendetta, nothing solid. You almost always begin by looking at those closest to the victim. Friends, family, the last people to have seen them. In this case, it seems fairly apparent that the family was heavily involved in trying to get this crime solved, and no one in the family seems to have had anything to gain by Syble's disappearance. At the same time, if it were random, what drove the assailant to target Syble? Was it the house, the location, or something else entirely? We simply don't know. So what do you think happened here? Was Syble targeted by someone she knew? Was it just a random crime, which is why it's been so difficult to solve all these years? The one thing I know for certain is that this is a solvable case. I've covered a lot of cases where I don't imagine they're going to find the answers, but this is one where the answers are there. Someone in that community who lived there at that time or in the years since has some idea. Someone knows who did this. Unfortunately, unless someone comes forward, Syble is found, or forensic evidence finally unlocks the mystery. The vanishing of Syble Brumley will remain open, unsolved, and growing cold. If you're looking for more information about the vanishing of Syble Brumley, there are not a lot of news articles or information out there. It can be somewhat difficult to track down. However, the Shreveport Times had the most thorough coverage, and this episode would have been impossible without their hard work. If you have any idea what happened to Syble Brumley, please contact the DeSoto Parish Sheriff's Office at 318-872-3956. Her case number is 970-4293. A $50,000 reward remains in place for information leading to Syble's recovery or the arrest of her assailant. What do you believe happened? Tweet me at TraceEvPod, email me at traceevidencepod@gmail.com, or comment in the Facebook group. At this time, I'd like to take a moment to thank our very amazing Patreon producers. Thank you to Alicia Townsend, Amy Guthrie, Andrew Guarino, Ann Bertram, Brittany Bivens, Christine Greco, Denise Dingsdale, Donna Buttram, Diane Dyson, Eamon Brady, Eloanne Meyer, Fabulous TT, Greg, Guillerme Pinto, Haley Christie, James, Jennifer Winkler, Jill Sense, Joni Berkowitz, Julie Mangano, Kara Moreland, Lars Jensen Fengel, Leslie B., Marla Wright, Melissa Breckeisen, Nick Mohar Schurz, Quinn McBreen, Sarah Lyons, Susie the Cutie, Travis Skepko, Stacy Finnegan, Stephanie Joyner, Stephanie Eve, Tiffany Nelson, Tom Archer, and Tom Radford. Thank you so much for your amazing support. Without you, this show would not be possible. If you're interested in learning more about this case or other cases featured on the show, please visit trace-evidence.com. There you can find case breakdowns, all social media links, merchandise shops, case descriptions, media, and options for donating, including PayPal and Patreon, should you wish to support the show. This concludes our coverage of the mysterious disappearance of Syble Brumley, a truly confounding case that I believe is solvable, and hopefully sooner than later those answers are going to be found. I want to thank you again for listening, and I hope you'll join me next week for another unsolved case on the next episode of Trace Evidence.